Hey everyone, Pastor Patrick Walker here. We are in Exodus chapter 2. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman. She became pregnant, gave birth to a son. And when she saw this was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months because at this point, the Egyptians had issued a decree that all new baby boys born were to be thrown into the Nile. Now, at this point, we know that Moses was the third born. Miriam was the oldest. Aaron is his older brother by a few years. Miriam may have been as old as 7 or 8, as we will see, because at the age of 3 months, she felt like she couldn't protect him and hide him any longer. She constructed a basket, papyrus basket, coated it with tar and pitch, placed her child, who was not named Moses at the time. That was the name that Pharaoh's daughter had given to him. So we don't know what his original name was, but placed baby in the basket and put him out among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Now, it appears, verse 4, that Miriam, his sister, stood at a distance to see what would happen. Perhaps the basket drifted downstream. It had to have been very, very close to wherever Pharaoh's daughter went, close to the palace grounds. Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe with her attendants. You know the story. They see the basket. Baby starts crying. She sends one of her servants to go get him. And he is brought back. And at that point, how old would Miriam have to be? 7 or 8 at the time? She's pretty quick thinking. And she somehow gains access, and she boldly comes up to Pharaoh's daughter and says, "Shall I get one of the Hebrew women to nurse this crying baby for you?" And she says, "Yes." And what does she do? She runs home and gets her mom, which is genius. So the mom comes back, and Pharaoh's daughter basically says, "Hey, I'll pay you to nurse this child. But essentially, this child is mine." I would assume she would have sent home some kind of signed or sealed letter that would essentially communicate that Moses' mother was in the service of, the daughter of Pharaoh, and she was doing this. This male child was in particular special and was essentially property or belonged to someone in the royal household. So she goes ahead and nurses him. He may have been 2, 3 years old. I don't know when she brought him back. But in verse 10, it says she brought him back, and the child grew older and was brought to Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, if we continue in chapter 2, 40 years passes. And in verse 11, Moses is now grown up. We know he was 40 years old when this incident happened. So a lot of time has gone by. He is out inspecting the work progress. He obviously knows about the Hebrew people being his people, even though he was raised as an Egyptian. And he steps in, probably in anger, to kill this Egyptian who was beating this Hebrew. And the next day, he sees 2 Hebrews fighting. He tries to step in to break it up, and they said, verse 14, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us?" Which is exactly what he was called to be, a ruler and the judge, because we see this later in Exodus. So kind of ironic, because that is his God-given calling, but the means by which he was to step into that, and I think he knew that that was his calling, and perhaps tried to step into it in his own strength, or at least not in agreement with the timing of God. And as I discussed in a previous devotional, I think if we crunch the numbers, I think the people had been in slavery for about 40 years up to Moses' birth, a maximum of 40 years. Then we have 40 more years as he grows up. So it's been about 80 years maximum. And so I believe that Moses at this point recognizes that he is called to be the ruler and judge of the deliverer of the people. But how does he go about achieving, that calling from God is the question. Well, obviously the word has spread and Moses is afraid and he fears that what he has done will become known to Pharaoh, and it does, verse 15, and he flees for his life. And he runs to Midian. And Midian's, I wish I could show you a map, far away. It's not just crossing the swamp, and it's not going into the Sinai Peninsula. So he runs away. He eventually arrives at this well where he sees some shepherdess coming, and some other shepherds try to drive them away. He stands up. We see his character. We see Moses' character displayed in Exodus chapter 2. He's very quick to fight against oppression and injustice. And he's obviously physically strong because he's able to intimidate or scare away or personally wrestle, fight these shepherds. And he's humble enough to be willing to serve and water the flocks of these women, these daughters of Jethro. So the girls go back, they tell their father. Father says, who is this guy? Did you invite him? I mean, we didn't even reward him. I mean, Moses wasn't doing this for a reward. That's another aspect of his character here. He seems to be genuinely motivated for justice. And of course, we know that God was preparing his character all throughout this. So I find great encouragement that when we find ourselves in the simplest of circumstances, God is still sovereignly in control and is preparing us for his calling for our lives. And Moses had to spend the first 2/3 of his life preparing, and the last third was the deliverance and then the shepherding of the people while in the wilderness. So the father-in-law, who's called by two names, Reuel or Jethro, I think one is his last, one is Jethro is his first name. He invites Moses to come and stay with him. He's obviously Egyptian because they go back and say, hey, an Egyptian rescued us. So his dress, his speech, I would assume, having grown up in the royal household, that Moses knew multiple languages, including Hebrew, obviously, Egyptian, probably some of the surrounding languages, was well-schooled, well-versed. And I know that Jewish legend says that he was one of the Egyptian military commanders and generals. So he would have been trained in the art of war, trained in the arts and culture, trained in language, all of that. And we see another 40 years going to skip by here pretty quickly because it says, during that long period, this is verse 23, the king of Egypt died. So the Pharaoh that had wanted to kill Moses died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groanings, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So last thing I'll say is we got 40 years in slavery. Moses is born. Another 40 years. After 80 years maximum, he tries to rescue in his strength, in his timing. He is definitely called to be the deliverer, but we need to be in alignment with not only what is God's will, but how to go about accomplishing it and when. And those three things are very difficult to coordinate. We see his character displayed here as he rescuer. He's the deliverer. He's a rescuer. Tries to rescue the Hebrew who was being beaten. He tries to judge between the two Hebrews who were fighting. He rescues the daughters of Jethro at the well. So we see his character being developed in the wilderness. And for 40 more years, he is a shepherd taking care of Jethro's flocks. So, you see him in the humblest, from the greatest of circumstances to the humblest of circumstances. Reminds me of some of those movies where you have this guy in rags kind of show up and nobody knows who he is. And they think very little of him until he turns out to be like the world's greatest sword fighter or someone's incredibly special. So I'm wondering, when did they find out who Moses really was? Did he tell them? When did they find out that this is one of the most powerful men trained, in the art of war, one of the greatest generals, cultured, educated, the highest level, and yet he's just walking in humility and trying to, at least for a time, forget his past. So I can really identify with Moses. I think most of us can, as we go through certain periods of life where we struggle and where our world is completely flipped upside down. And the last thing I want to say here about these last couple of verses, verse 23, 24, 25. Now, the NIV doesn't communicate this, but I think this is true when it says the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. I don't think that's just, complaining. I think that's, when that phrase is used elsewhere in the Bible, it refers to prayer. And I'm just wondering, because now we're at 120 years of slavery. Did it take that long for the people to be broken and to turn to the Lord in prayer as one? I don't know. You're speculating here, but it's quite possible. It says God heard their groanings. They cried out, and their cry went up to God. And that word is often used in the Psalms for prayer, a prayer of distress, and God heard. So God heard the prayer and answered the prayer. I think this could be argued as an example of answered prayer, And I can only wonder how long did it take them to stop complaining or to stop trying to secure their own freedom and to turn to the Lord in prayer. Oftentimes, which is the mistake of many of us, we don't turn to God first. We seem to turn to God last. But when they turn to God, nonetheless, God heard it, God responds, and he begins in his timing and in his way to bring about deliverance for his people. And I think that's a wonderful place to end. All right? Till next time, God bless.